at the opposite end of this quote, where Mario Carpo was saying that back in the Renaissance, or like just before, or like when printing was involved, buildings could not travel, so people had to. And we find ourselves in March 2020 in a point where people could not travel, so buildings had to. So we started looking at what is even the meaning and the use of spaces that are accessible only online, that don't have a physical counterpart, something that we had never really considered that much doing before. And we created a series of experimental spaces like the gallery that you saw before. Then we got a bit more encouraged by how well it was behaving to basically bring the exhibition online, which was in itself a bit of a challenge because it was completely thought for a physical space, and we had to do something that very much resembled the physical space that I was referring to. And then we got our first fully virtual commission for what we would call almost a civic space. Basically a conference center for the Archia Proxima conference that was curated by Gonzalo Herrero Delicado in 2020, which usually looks like this. It's a very important conference for young Spanish and Portuguese architects, where awards and grants are given to very young practices. So not only this is a very important moment in their careers of those nominated and awarded, but it's also a very important moment in which a network is created, a network of a generational network, a network of people that is gonna carry on through, probably in parallel, throughout their careers. So we understood this as a deep 2D space, basically as a website that you walk into, or like that you walk through, and you see many spaces in these different rooms that we created that involve an element of flatness and of like 1920 by 1080 format or proportions, with then sort of gardens or spaces resembling sort of gardens or leisure spaces, or just simply spaces that are interesting to circulate through on the sides, where you could step on the side if you met somebody that you wanted to hang out with while others were continuing looking at the exhibit. And then it had a central space that was the space where lectures were given or projected by those who preferred to join that way, and where people was coming together in that space. Interestingly, this brought to us this strange challenge that we never thought we had to face, of designing what the people would look like in your space for technical reasons. The avatars had to be incredibly light to ensure that all devices could handle it. So we designed this sort of card-like avatars that are basically one plane, very low polygon, and well, being the most important element of this, the fact that you had spatial audio and you could identify where others were, and by coming close to them, you could have these like side conversations.
And the last project we wanted to show is not our latest project, but it relates to the work we're doing right now. It's Greater Bright Lights, which we had the pleasure of working on together with MMCA in Seoul, South Korea, at the Doksugung Palace, which is the last palace of the last emperor. It happens to be located in the gate that leads into the emperor's private bedchambers, where we installed a large LED screen, which actually blocks the entrance. You can actually walk around the gate because it's a freestanding structure now after it was reconstructed. But it basically serves as a kind of virtual portal that leads into that previous space, as a kind of metaphorical commentary on what portals and what doorways and gateways means, and what access means in the 21st century. Here we can see a snapshot of what one of the first scenes looks like when the original historic gates open leading into the doorway. And again, our kind of view a fact that doors and portals before mass media were literal barriers. There were no way to see through to the other side. Of course, today a door is merely a barrier for our body. There's potential for us to see through that door, no problem at all, with live streaming and all sorts of other ways. So that there's the door as separating spaces is no longer functioning in the same way, which is why we don't see portals looking like this anymore. And our argument that in the 21st century, the gates to the most revered places are indeed virtual. So that's what the film then does. It kind of goes through a series throughout kind of media history, looking at interfaces as if they are literal doorways, and creating them as sort of almost ceremonial moments, going through the interface of Tinder or WeChat or whichever app there happens to be. And that relates to our current research project, which will be done by next summer, which is on the issues related to virtual and magical portals throughout history and what they might mean to us now and what they meant in the past. And that concludes our presentation today, taking you through a very rough overview of our interest and our recent work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura and Fredrik.
Now I have to figure out also how to stop sharing. There we go.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm so impressed and inspired by your work, the complexity and the depth of the research, and the topics you have addressed actually really unfolded so many discussion we would have. And now let's take a 10-minute break before we start the Q&A and roundtable discussion. So we could come back at 10 to 10, which is, I believe, 10 to 3 in the European time. Okay. See you guys later.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks so much to our guests and their generosity on sharing their works, which has been really inspiring. Thanks to Sean, Jack, Laura, and Frederick. You gave us unbelievable, amazing presentation and deep reflections. So let's begin with the most exciting part, which is the Q&A and the roundtable discussion. Does anyone have a question? You raise the first one.
Yes. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Actually, I have a question to ask Jack. Xin and I graduated from San Arcan Architecture School, and our instructor Peter Testa recommended the article The Big Flat Now to me, and I was inspired a lot. So we did our graduation thesis, and when we did our graduation thesis, we did a lot of research about these articles. So we were trying to flatten the time and the space, freely manipulate materiality and form, the digital tools and physical objects. And like we have already seen Big Flat Now play an important role and get success in the fashion industry. So my question is Big Flat Now a good strategy for future design? And why do you think it is important? And how will it influence architectural design? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's a complex question. And so I'll try to answer as best I can. The other thing I should say is it's now been several years since I wrote that article, and it's also, I have not read it since I wrote it. So I don't remember entirely what's in it. But the questions which I was asking myself at the time were to do with, you could call it the recycling of the past, but in a way it was the way in which, through things like an interest in vintage fashion, an interest in the imagery from recent years, the way in which they now have an active role in communication, and the way that the past becomes a direct material for the present, and the extent to which the future becomes very precarious and unknown. So the future becomes much shorter, and you end up in a very kind of extended present. But we were also talking about real time, and we were talking about the way in which the synchronization of all people to each other through these networks creates a kind of great flatness in networks, which gives us also the impression of it always being now, basically. I actually have come to the opinion that this is not so good. At the time, I was quite optimistic about the possibility of flattening culture, to say, well, you know, I had in my mind when I joined Twitter in 2009, I was able to write directly to the director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I was a student. I was living in social housing. I was very poor. I couldn't afford the bus. And then suddenly I'm talking and having a conversation with someone who is in a significant power position. And I imagine that this flatness creates this type of exchange where power hierarchies become weaker. But in the end, I'm not sure that that is what is happening. I think in a way, the flatness actually just conceals lots of inequalities in terms of who controls those. I'm thinking particularly of algorithms. When I joined Twitter, all tweets were chronological, so it was uncontrolled. But if you think of TikTok, everything is hyper controlled. You see only what the algorithm wants to give you. And that actually damages this flatness. It makes it less flat. In terms of architecture, I think we could point to collaborative design tools, perhaps like some of the work that Sean, Fred, and Lara were talking about. The idea of participatory design, which perhaps flattens the hierarchy. The architect, which is an invention, as Fred and Lara were saying, it's an invention of the 1500s in Italy. So it's a very particular culture and time. This figure is kind of seen like an artist and a hero, the person who can save society through their genius. And I think maybe this flatness that we're talking about is beginning to say that the way to address spatial conditions is through collective and collaborative and participatory design. And these tools, these digital tools, make that possible in a way that previous design tools, I think, didn't make that possible. So sorry for the long answer.
Thank you for your answer. I just added some comments based on your answer. So I noticed that you mentioned the Twitter was chronological order, and the TikTok is based on the algorithm. I remember Instagram was like a few years ago, it was purely chronological. But now, if I scroll down, it always refresh to new posts. It seems that it calculates to have a best output, best advertising output for the company. And then you mentioned the power of architect and the participatory design. I think for the Big Flat now, how it influenced our design was more about the formal making. For example, if we were gonna build a skyscraper, we first have a massing form, and then we slice it by the floor height, and then we add the facade glazings. So it has hierarchy. But if we flatten the hierarchy of these elements, we could source we could have a massing as A, and glazing shape as B, and the floor height as C, and we freely compose different elements without hierarchy, without order. That would probably create a form which is quite free, like the texture and the form is not correlational. Instead of text always yield to the form of that 3D objects.
Yeah. I think that's very interesting. I think this idea of feedback loops between different elements, so that in design there may not be a hierarchy, is very interesting. But my question always about formal innovation, let's say, is what effect does it have on the world? For example, I can add ornamentation to any structure I design, but some ornamentation I add, but the question is why, right? Like some of the ornament that I might use is some spatial. So for example, in a house I designed last year, there was a column which was non-structural, but it was there in order to create a visual barrier between two spaces. And this, for me, is an ornamental column, even though it just looks very plain. Or is it communicating about a cultural condition or a financial condition, or what is this kind of innovation really pointing to? Because otherwise, I find it very difficult to make to take an opinion about why something should be one way and not another. Like why the floor height will be 2.4 meters and not 3.8 meters. I don't know how to make that decision if I don't know what the effect or what the purpose is. But I don't know if your own reflections on what I've just said and kind of flatness and purpose.
I have another question. Do you think John Soane Museum is an example of the big flat now? Because from my point of view, that museum is like a cabinet of curiosities. It contains a lot of stuff from different edges and from different locations. And they bring all different stuff together into that one small space. So does it flatten the space and the time of those different objects? What do you think?
Definitely. I definitely agree. I think it's a very good example, especially because the way that the objects are also without hierarchy. They basically are just put in the space wherever there is enough space. And you get no real strong sense that there is curation or organization to these objects. They're just all present at the same time. But yeah, it's a good observation.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack, for your generous response. And actually, we already have a lot of questions coming from our audiences over the streaming platform. So I would, I think Hupeng, you have another question.
Yes,
Sean?
I have a question for Sean. Are you here? Hi. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that you have traveled to China as a scholar. I'm not sure, is that right? So do you think the wireless landscape you met in China have any connection with what you are doing now? Any inspirations or criticism is okay?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess the reason I went to China was I had like a MAD Architects Fellowship where they gave me a small amount of money to go and travel around China and kind of investigate a few things, personal investigations, I guess. But what I tried to do whilst I was in China was try to kind of bring together this historical artifacts or historical emblems of China from like a westernized point of view, like what we visualize Chinese culture or Chinese architecture, but then also juxtapose it with this kind of massive growth, obviously, in cities, and the fact that you can take a train from around China for 4 or 5 hours, and you would pass like 3 or 4 cities that have not like been finalized. They're sitting there as shells. I guess in some ways is a credit to capitalism and the production. But also in doing that, there's also these kind of like architectural objects that have been designed within China, like I think it's the Guangdong circle. It's just like this big emblem, or like the replication of Paris. And there's this kind of weird consumerism, I guess, of like Western culture that, or Western architecture in general, that is like supplanted into small areas of China, which I think is particularly interesting because there's these kind of strange dead zones in quite a lot of ways. There's maybe a few people living there, and they're kind of like ghost towns in some ways as well, but particularly interesting just because of the architectural objects that appear as these very grandiose emblems, I guess, of certain towns or certain cities. But then when you actually approach them, sure, they might be like kind of glittered in gold. When I'm thinking of this Guangzhou circle, I hope I got that right. It's like this massive golden circle that's empty. It doesn't have anybody in it. I managed to get inside, and there's a pretty crummy shopping center, or not even shopping center. It's like a supermarket on the first floor, and a small museum on the ground floor. But I think it's super interesting, this kind of mass, I guess, consumerism of these architectural objects and the way that we perceive parts of China from a Western perspective, but also like the way that these cities are kind of built around these architectural objects, which is obviously something that we are designing. Specifically, when I went, we were investigating quite heavily into the notion of the architectural object and some emblems of a triple O. But my goal essentially when I was there was to 3D scan these strange artifacts and bring them towards more historical places, like put in this circle on the Great Wall of China or something like this that contrasts both of these historical and future-facing commercialization of these architectural objects. A strange connection, I guess, but nonetheless incredibly interesting. I guess, and also just, hopefully I've not just rambled on there for a bit, but I have a question, or maybe an addition to the point that Jack was making as well about the Johnson building, or Johnson House, or whatever we're calling it. And I think one of the nice things that you spoke about is this idea that there's a flatness or a non-hierarchical ordering of ornamentation or artifacts that have been collected. But I guess the first thing that I thought of is, would that be the same as Amazon warehouse, where there's no correlation between organization from a human centered perspective? So things might be organized not in the way that you would expect it, for instance, at a supermarket where you would buy toothpaste beside shampoo, but rather in an Amazon warehouse, you might have shampoo beside, I don't know, architectural books, because they've been correlated by an algorithm, and then there's a spatial relationship that is beyond, in some ways, human comprehension. So I wonder if the irony in that is that the Johnson project is very well curated, but not in a way that we understand it. Hopefully, it's not really a question, but more of a observation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the connection between Johnson and an Amazon warehouse is a very close one. Ultimately, the question of whether information or systems are legible is an important one, but it also has to do, I think part of moving into a kind of era of flatness is also the meaning of the systems no longer have to be understood by the person who is using them as part of their own creative process. So you could say, for example, I mean, certainly John Sohn had an idea about why objects are where they are. Now, because I don't understand the history of those objects or understand the context of them, I can't read that in the same way that if I enter an Amazon warehouse, I don't know why the algorithm which has decided to put those objects next to each other is invisible to me. However, the objects are there, and therefore I will be able to create a connection out of it. And I think in terms of social media, I may not understand the origin of a photograph from the 1970s or the context of a car from the 1990s. But the two of those images next to each other immediately begins to create a space which is between it, which is the input or the inspiration for another layer of design. So in that sense, the ability to arrange, rearrange by coincidence or by intent, all sorts of different types of material, which is no longer categorized by any type of hierarchy, is in itself, I think, well, it's leading to some issues as well. I mean, one of the issues is it's not really possible anymore to escape trends, because the material that's being presented to you is no longer random. Actually, it's now being curated by other algorithms. So what you think you're discovering, you're not discovering. But it is having another positive effect, which is that I think less and less we are asking or expecting to see things which are new. What we're interested in is whether things are relevant. And the difference between newness and relevance is newness is something that you've never seen before, and relevance is about something which has a meaningful communication to you today. It appears, it could be a very familiar object or image or piece of communication, but it appears at the moment which seems to contribute to your understanding of the world. And we see it more and more in fashion, that there is less newness and more relevance. And we see it also in, I mean, architecture isn't quite there yet. There's still an obsession, I think, with newness in architecture, which hopefully will move beyond soon.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I think this dialogue is really, really amazing. And I'm actually, I think the analog between Amazon and the Johnson Museum is really interesting. And I'm wondering, how is your reflection, Frederick and Lara? What would you say about this particular case?
Well, thanks for bringing us in, Eva. I think one thing that would, I think, be interesting to reflect on here as a kind of umbrella issue to all of this, which could seem as something unproductive or even halting. I mean, we've talked about, or things have come up relating to nostalgia and other things, but I think one key thing, Jack, you mentioned legibility, and then this abstract reading of something like a house museum and the machine of a warehouse. I think one thing that is always very important to keep in mind with when we are interacting between different disciplines, like I think all of us are, and it seems like everyone here and the audience perhaps as well, is how coming from architecture and maybe in all of our cases touching a little bit on art, etc., that terminology is incredibly loose, and therefore legibility is also very loose, which means that interpretations can run wild completely, which means that you can have incredible agency with using a word like flatness sorry, Jack, I haven't read this article, but the word flatness can be used in such a myriad of ways. I think we were using it as well in our talk in a very different way from what you were using it, Jack, and from what the question was about flatness and these issues in formal design of buildings. Like that those things can be spoken about with the same word means that we could see it as a problem, but I think it's something that is important to almost invite, because we're not going to get beyond it. Like in order to deal with a session like this, especially that's cross-continental and there's people from all over the world, we would need like a glossary and say, like, we don't care what words you use in your day-to-day practice. These are the words we use here. You know, for us, for instance, we don't use the word metaverse. We talk about the immersive internet. We interact a lot with the tech world, where you cannot really say architect because they think you're a technical architect, like a tech architect. Like literally, I don't know how many times it's happened when we've been in conferences, discussions, say, I'm an architect. They go like, yeah, I'm also an architect. It's like, no, the other kind. And they go like, what other kind? There's so many examples of where, and obviously in their world, terminology often is consequential. Like what you call something has consequences for either the economy of your company, etc., or where the exchange between people has real consequences. Like, whereas I think in many of the examples that we probably move around in, if we actually agree on what a word means, has less consequence. It could be interesting if we end up like, yeah, flatness could mean this, but we accept all other forms of interpretations. I think that's just an interesting, like, and it is why you get these like incredibly weird comparisons between the Johnson Museum and an Amazon warehouse. I think in a sense we could get lost in those comparisons, but it's also something I think to celebrate, as long as we know that we're playing with these comparisons, right? And they have the potential to become consequential if we can agree on the legibility and the syntax of how are we going to read these things, because we see a lot of diversity, but also a lot of like quite unproductive like overlaps where like we could probably worked on the exact same arguments, we just call them different things and we would never know.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's actually like constructing kind of parallel of this terminology or like overlapping idea or concepts. Nowadays in the immersive internet is becoming quite, I would think it's quite interesting and inspiring on how we define the disciplines and how we actually see what we conventionally would regard it. Now we have another audiences to raise their questions. So would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Frederick. Yeah. Hi, Sean. Sincerely appreciate for your generous sharing works and knowledge. I would like to ask that, do you think it would be a trend of architect to embrace digital art related to what we do, especially in the context of China? And what would be your advice for young generation architects who deciding to switch their career from traditional architectural industry to digital?
I think I missed some of that there, but I'm gonna go with what I heard. So my understanding of the question was that like some sort of, I guess, advice on an architect switching towards more of a digital artist, right? Was that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. So I think the first thing from my perspective is that there shouldn't be a differentiation. I think our architects are in a sphere that anything spatial is within our domain. Not to be too master builder about it, but I think we're capable within any kind of spatial realm to investigate architectural ideas and architectural concerns, whether that's through digital art or mixed realities or something as simple as like an Instagram or Facebook filter. I think these are within architectural or within the architectural realm. The same way as I think that architects are predominantly very great game designers as well. Not so much in the programming side of things, but more in the sense of being able to orchestrate or construct space in a specific narrative. Whether it's combining new aesthetics or like some sort of spatial sequence. So I think in terms of that, I think lean into the skills you have as an architect that is a spatial thinker. I think there doesn't have to be this kind of distinction between I'm an architect, therefore I need to build buildings and I need to do documentation in Revit or something like this, but rather it's just taking this framework or this education that we've been given, I guess, is within spatial, I guess, design. I think that's the way that I would approach it in terms of how I would approach being a digital artist as well, is thinking purely spatial, because I think that's one thing that architects have as an advantage. It's not this type of language or the type of design is not articulated very clearly if you're becoming like a graphic designer. It's a different set of rules, I guess.
Yes, and if I may add to that, I think Sean was putting it very well. There is also another side to that argument, no? That is, if you speak very directly of how does a practice sustain itself if you don't define what you provide. No? I mean, in the end, in a very simple way, people will hopefully come to you looking for something. On the other hand, I mean, you may initiate your own projects. No, if you go more the way that Sean is describing, you'll probably end up basically promoting or producing and making your own projects happen, in which case you might end up more in the realm of platform building, which has a completely different time span to the sort of architectural project that goes on commission basis. And on the other hand, if you would like to work with commissions, then I think you kind of have to sit yourself in one place that people can understand. Now, whether you can carve out that role for yourself, usually through media, through the way you make yourself be perceived, and therefore be found. You might carve that role for yourself, but you still kind of need to define it. And this is coming from somebody who we've been trying really hard to not be pigeonholed, and in the end, maybe the answer is to be pigeonholed in 4 or 5 roles to maintain maybe that variety that some people is interested in, right? But I do think that even if roles and disciplines evolve at quite a fast pace, it's kind of professionally, it is important in order to really move at the pace that you may want in terms of getting commissions and working on projects and so on. It is important to define that role in some way. So
I think that's super interesting, because I think personally, I think that's one thing that I struggle with in terms of trying to describe myself as a single entity, whether I'm an architectural designer or an XR developer or any of these other kind of umbrella terms. I think the interesting thing for me, and I'm sure anyone that has freelanced or done any of these kind of commission-based projects, clients seem to find you and then project what they want from you. Sometimes, or from my perspective anyways, it's never been someone coming and saying, I've seen you do this, replicate it. It's more the client comes with an idea and then somehow expects you to fulfill that idea, whether it's within the realm of digital art or coding or building a video game or whatever. I feel like there's always the flexibility of being able to kind of take on roles. And I think it sounds like it's a super entrepreneurial thing, but I think it's like Richard Branson that said something like, if you get offered a job and you don't know how to do it, tell them yes, and then you'll figure out how to do it. So I think from that perspective, I think just being able to work flexibly and think flexibly about the way that you approach some of these things from that side of things, business side of things, I think it's fine to be open-ended, but I think you might, like Lara said, you might end up picking up more commissions if you're very specific.
My comments are quite general and relate to how to approach your career. The first design problem of any designer, not just architects, is how to design yourself and how to design your practice, which could be your company or could be your public image. And so the way that I thought about this myself was I asked myself some very simple questions. Do I like to work in a team or do I like to work by myself? Do I like to be the boss, or am I okay to be an employee? Do I want to work always in an office, or do I want the flexibility to work from home or in another type of place? How much money do I want to earn? You know, in my case, it sounds like a very banal, like not a creative question, but it's important because if you want to have a family, if you want to own property, then you cannot choose certain paths. And so when I asked myself a lot of these questions, it began to make clear a kind of space where the types of companies I could work for, the types of jobs I could do. And then I started the next thing I did after that was I wrote my own biography. You know, these days, most people have, or many people have, a personal website or a professional website, and there's like a about page. And even if you haven't created the company, even if you don't know what you will do, even if
Oh, sorry, Jack, we lost you.
We lost a minute.
Hopefully, yeah, sorry. What I was saying is, as soon as you start to write your about page, as soon as you start to put it in words, you already create the reality that you want to live in. And anyone who reads it, if you say, my work is about exploring the future of the digital, everyone who reads it will go, his work is about the future of exploring the digital, even if you've never done a project that is in that field. So the two things I would encourage are, first, asking questions about how you like to work. Do you want to be a big public figure, or are you actually a private person? Do you want to have 100 million followers, or actually do you not care about followers? And why would you? What is the value of that? Do you want to be part of a community? Do you want to live in the mountains? I mean, there's many questions like this which can help you to define, even before you get to the question of, am I going to do work in physical architecture or digital architecture? Or, as Sean so rightly said, the not recognizing the difference between the two, or saying that they are all one. Anyway, I conclude by just saying that I've been calling myself an architect since I finished my first degree, which was 3 years long. And I hadn't yet finished my master's degree. And in the United Kingdom, you have to do an exam to call yourself an architect once you graduate. But I've been calling myself an architect before that because that's how I felt I wanted to describe myself. And even when I work in the world of fashion, or even when I work in the world of graphic design or magazine, I always insist that I'm an architect. And because they say, like, well, architects don't do this. Architects don't do creative direction. And I'm like, well, I'm an architect and I'm doing it. So yeah, they can. Anyway, that's it for me. I hope that was helpful in some way.
Yeah, it's really helpful. And speaking of discipline, it kind of reminded me of the conversation that we had yesterday with a very young digital artist. And he said that he's not a fan of perfection. So when he starts to work, he kind of starts with scratches and like simple iteration of objects. And so he kind of take this iteration as what defines his work. So I'm wondering, maybe in the future, in the digital world, in the metaverse, maybe there will be no discipline, or maybe we will construct like iteration or like layers of disciplines. And I mean, in this age that everyone is kind of DJing the music, maybe, I don't know if there's a chance that the boundary will be blurred and there will be more like anonymity for everyone to be a designer, be an artist, be an architect. And yeah, I think it's it's a really interesting topic to address too.
Can I say something to that though? Because I think the idea that everyone can be involved in design is a really good idea, but we have to be very careful about how they are involved in design, because it's a little bit like saying everyone should be a doctor. It's like you should have a lot of control over your body and over your health. But in the end, a doctor is a professional body of knowledge. And even though I work in fashion, in graphic design, in magazines, in art direction, photography, and so on, I am not a graphic designer. I'm not a fashion designer. And that because I recognize that that is a special body of knowledge, which takes a long time and requires a lot of professional knowledge to do. So I'm very big fan of interdisciplinary collaboration. You know, what happens, how do we talk when an architect and an artist and other types of designers, when they work together, what can they produce, which is maybe more than all of those disciplines? But the idea that we have no disciplines anymore, I think will mean that we will lose a lot of specialist knowledge, because it's not possible to know everything about, for example, how to print a book. There's, you know, it's a huge body of knowledge, in the same way that it's not possible for a print designer to know how to make a building. There's a lot of knowledge involved. So yes, I'm really interested in this extra layer, which is a place where we can collaborate. But I don't want to remove disciplines.
I think I completely agree with that. And I mean, you can think about this even like in the earliest forms of ceremony involve the formation of roles so that we can do something that is greater than one of us alone. Right? So you can think about it in a very pure and romanticized way, that hopefully not the specializations, the establishment of roles sometimes can go really wrong, but when it's at its best is so that we can do something greater than what one of us could do together. And in that sense, then it becomes really fundamental. And I think in understanding disciplines that seem a bit where for some reason it's harder to understand what that specialization is, because it's sort of easy to access, like design. I like always the comparison to, like, I think another field to which this happens slightly is therapy or psychology, where one would think that you can help a friend by having a conversation, and you probably can to a certain extent, but you will never be doing that which a therapist would do. You would never ask the questions that that person asks. You would never take it from those angles just simply because you don't have that body of knowledge, right? So I think that will probably be the angle, which is precisely what Jack was saying. Of course, when we're talking about a discipline being based on a body of knowledge, there is always the question of whether that body of knowledge will eventually be able to be computed in a certain way, right? And then this is very much a reality. I think that is what will be interesting, or like what to me is most interesting is that which cannot be computed, no? Which takes you to the essence of what humans are good at, or what humans will remain to be good at. And maybe I'm jumping quite ahead, but I think if you are always thinking about that, and applying that to yourself, like what is it really that I can offer that nothing else can offer, as opposed to creating the illusion of you being able to offer something that actually maybe everyone can do by themselves, then you will probably find a lot more of a sense of purpose in what you do.
Maybe one thing that's kind of interesting about the design, I guess, education and alongside it, the pedagogy, is that there's like a mass democratization of design, I guess, language, design education through software or through tools, where there's this perception that architecture graphic design, and a whole series of other design disciplines can be learned or can be harnessed by knowing Photoshop, by knowing Rhino, by knowing some of these other tools that are like the fundamentals for the discipline, which I think is in some ways kind of strange, because there is this body of knowledge that I guess that architects and designers harness. But I guess one thing that I was thinking about when we were talking about it there was the way that this body of knowledge is retained as like a repository. So if you just think from a purely like software engineering side of things, the fact that there's so many of these open source projects on GitHub, repositories of coding knowledge that basically through, I'm sure, a whole series of YouTube videos and projects yourself, you can actually become a software engineer or a developer. And I think there's this kind of perception that you can do the same with many of these design disciplines. And I think fundamentally you can learn quite a lot about architecture through YouTube. And I think in that way, there's a question though, is discipline really like as segmented as we think it is? And if it is, are we kind of clinging on to a hierarchy to feel important in many ways? Because I kind of question whether that knowledge is so much more learned through higher education, or if I can learn by doing in many ways, the same way as a software engineer can without going to study computer science for 4 years. Not to put a...
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we shouldn't just say that all knowledge of a discipline or profession comes through university. It has a lot to do with, I would say, much more, the role of university, if it has a role at all. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Yeah. If university has a role at all, it's to provide a basis so that you can have a structure to how you interpret your experience. So a lot of people can gain a lot of experience of a discipline through experience, but sometimes that information is not necessarily very well structured. At least for me, the value of university is in the end nothing to do with content. It's to do with structure. So what I got out of university was the ability to make an argument, the ability to organize information, the ability to execute a project, how to understand these types of things. And then all the other knowledge I have is through experience.
I think that's really, really nice, the way to look at it, because I think you're kind of, or what I got out of university is like being, or learning to learn, or learning, or teaching yourself, or teaching through an educator, the way in which you can learn yourself in many ways. Because I think you're kind of fondering, or like you go on YouTube for sure, or you go on some articles online, or read the latest log or whatever. You're trying to digest this information, and I think it's a nice way to put that perspective. It's quite hard to structure that information in a useful way in many ways to actually be yeah. No, I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting conversation. I mean, constructing the alternative kind of version as the repository is quite an interesting topic to bring up. And speaking of that, we have another question coming from our audience, and I will read this. There's no doubt that post-digital design should be a topic of far beyond time-space scale. But when we think about digital vision in the architecture or urbanism territories, we really cannot avoid scale. How do you think about the relationship between the object in this topic and scaling module in our original discipline? Would anyone to answer this question from our audience?
It's very broad, no? The question, but we can try and address this. To begin with, I think that this term post-digital is not super useful because it's prone to so many misunderstandings. Because post is often understood as something being quite direct. People understand what that means. Of course, in many ways, one could read that as being we're not going to anything post-digital at all, rather the reversed. But in terms of, if I understood correctly, at scale, or sort of urbanism, etc., that's something that architects traditionally have been quite bad at handling, or at least in the generation that we have been trained in. I think we are similar generation, all of us, that were kind of at the back end of the super object-heavy, individual building heavy era of architecture, where all that matters was that if your output was discrete and containable, that you could photograph the building, or it could be understood in a context. Whereas I think now, at least education, and I think practice generally is much more concerned, which I think is very positively, beyond the individual object and looking at bigger context, which I think has really interesting implications. And I think you can see it. Probably I do not have enough experience of China, but I think from an external perspective, it seems very, very telling that there is a very, very strong period in architecture where there's a lot of object-focused architecture that was then abruptly ended, with a then focus more on how big systems connect and how cities connect. Is it nice to live in between these big objects or not? And less of a focus on what the individual buildings can do. And that certainly links up with what digital systems in urbanism is good for, at least if you think about how they have been designed to work, whether they end up being good for us or not. It's another question with tracking and monitoring, etc. That at the moment can be superficially seen as something positive for a lot of us, that you don't need to carry around cash, etc. Very, very simple things that we don't really ever think about, it, that you can magically get almost any vehicle to your location at any given time. These kind of large things that have much bigger implication than what the buildings happen to be doing. I mean, I think by and large, there's been very little innovation in the object of architecture in the last 50 years or so. So certainly probably the development of digital twins will be the next big phase. But the vast majority in the next 50 years will have to do with that personal experience at that scale. And that's probably also why we see migration going away from this, like designing enormous skyscrapers that look like whatever random thing, and more towards how we actually use them, using them intelligently. And I think also this links very interestingly to what Jack was saying earlier about newness. And if I understood you correctly, Jack, you were saying that hopefully this fascination with newness will be over soon in architecture. And I think that this is something that goes in waves that relates to big energy leaps or big stages in innovation. Or if you can look at previous times in human history when there were certain limitations of innovation, that meant that I love this quote from Heinrich Wölfflin, the German art critic, who said that ornament is the blossoming of a forest that has nothing more to achieve. So basically, when everything has been done and there's nothing more obvious to do, then we ornament and we decorate. And that doesn't mean that ornamentation is less than anything else. It just means that if you're busy and you don't have time or money or resources, or you're really busy with doing things that actually produce things, then by and large ornamentation might be accidental. But by and large, it's not, you don't spend time on it in a way that in certain moments in history, ornamentation is done a lot more frequently. So I think that's also another really interesting aspect, where I think at the moment there is relatively little innovation in the